Elijah Harrington sat on the park bench like he did most afternoons. A sturdy cane resting across his lap. He wasn't in a rush, he never was these days. A man of his age and experience had learned long ago that life moved whether you hurried it along or not. His hands, knotted and strong despite the years, held a tin cup of sweet tea he had brewed himself. Across the brim of his well-worn cap adorned with the faded insignia of his military service, his eyes scanned the quiet rhythm of the small town around him. Brooksville hadn't changed much in the decades he had lived there. The streets were still lined with red brick buildings, their weathered facades offering the same sense of familiarity they had when he'd first returned from the service. The younger generations had come and gone, and new faces had taken over the storefronts. Elijah could remember their parents and even their grandparents. He had shared meals with some, marched alongside others during the turbulent years when equality felt more like a promise than a reality. Most people didn't notice him much these days, not beyond a polite nod or a passing smile. He was an old man in their eyes, a relic of a time that felt far removed from their own. That suited him fine. He liked the stillness. It gave him time to think, to reflect on the many battles he had fought, both overseas and here at home. But today, the stillness seemed uneasy, like a storm waiting to break. Elijah had seen Officer Travis Bartlett's patrol car before it slowed to a crawl along the curb. The young officer, barely in his 30s, carried himself with the sort of swagger Elijah had encountered many times before. A man whose authority didn't rest on respect but on power and the fear he could instill. Travis had been in Brooksville only a few years but had already made a name for himself. Some people admired his so-called toughness. Others, mostly those whose skin wasn't the same shade as his, learned quickly to avoid his path when they could. The car came to a stop, and Elijah heard the heavy click of the door opening. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look up right away. His gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon, where the golden light of the afternoon sun danced lazily across the rooftops. "Hey, you," came the sharp bark of the officer's voice. Elijah turned slowly, his movements deliberate, measured. He took in the sight of Bartlett approaching, his boots heavy on the pavement, his baton swinging at his side like an unspoken threat. Bartlett's expression carried the kind of scorn that spoke louder than any words could. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone more accusation than question. Elijah let the silence hang for a moment before answering. "Just sitting, officer." The words were simple, calm, but they seemed to land wrong on Bartlett's ears. He narrowed his eyes, stepping closer so his shadow fell across Elijah's lap. "You don't look like you're from around here," Bartlett said, his voice lower now, more menacing. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "I've lived here most of my life." Bartlett's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the only sound between them was the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Elijah could see it now, the simmering anger just beneath the surface. It wasn't about him sitting on the bench. Not really. It was something deeper, something that ran through men like Bartlett as surely as blood. Elijah had seen it before. Long before Bartlett was even born. He knew it by heart. "Stand up," Bartlett ordered. Elijah sighed softly, placing his cane aside and pushing himself to his feet. His knees ached in protest, but he straightened as much as his years would allow. Bartlett loomed over him, younger, taller, brimming with authority that felt as hollow as the silence that followed. "What's your name?" Bartlett demanded. "Elijah Harrington," he replied evenly. Bartlett scribbled something onto a notepad, then glared at Elijah as if waiting for him to make a wrong move. "You got any ID on you?" Elijah nodded and reached into his pocket, moving deliberately so there could be no misunderstanding. He handed over his driver's license, its edges frayed from years of wear. Bartlett snatched it from his hand, studying it like it held some secret he was determined to uncover. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Bartlett asked again, though the answer had already been given. "I don't like people loitering. Especially people like you." Elijah heard the words for what they were, as sharp and deliberate as the baton hanging from Bartlett's belt. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. Decades of practice had taught him that men like Bartlett wanted a reaction. It fed something in them. Something ugly and unspoken. "I'm just sitting," Elijah said again, his tone as steady as the earth beneath his feet. Bartlett stepped closer, close enough that Elijah could feel the heat of his frustration. You think you're something special, don't you? Bartlett sneered, walking around like you've earned something. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. I've earned my peace, he said quietly. The words landed like a stone dropped in a still pond, rippling outward. Bartlett's scowl deepened, his fists clenching at his sides. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're lucky I don't drag you in right now. Elijah said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence, calm and unyielding, seemed to speak louder than anything Bartlett could muster. Around them, a few people had stopped to watch. Their whispers carried on the wind. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing the moment in grainy clarity. In the distance, another officer appeared, Dave Morgan, older, grayer, with a reputation for reason over force. His expression hardened as he took in the scene unfolding before him. Travis, he called out, his voice firm but measured. That's enough. For a moment, Bartlett didn't move, his grip on Elijah's license tightened, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. Then, with a sharp exhale, he handed the ID back and stepped away. Elijah returned to his seat. His movements slow, deliberate. He picked up his cane and his cup of tea. His posture as steady as ever. Morgan gave him a nod. A silent apology for the behavior of the man in uniform beside him. The crowd began to disperse, the tension lifting like smoke on a breezy afternoon. But Elijah knew it wasn't over. Men like Bartlett didn't just walk away. They carried their anger like a wound, festering until it found something to lash out against. As Bartlett walked back to his car, his boots hitting the pavement harder than before, Elijah sipped his tea, the sweet warmth grounding him. He stared out at the horizon, where the light had grown softer, gentler. He had faced storms before. He knew how to endure. The quiet rhythm of Brooksville had a way of lulling its residents into a false sense of permanence. The same familiar faces passed by the same brick storefronts, exchanging nods and half-smiles as if time itself had slowed to match their unhurried pace. But for Elijah Harrington, that rhythm had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways since the encounter on the park bench. He noticed it in the way people hesitated just a moment longer before greeting him, their eyes flickering with something unspoken. Some avoided him altogether, crossing the street or ducking into shops when they saw him coming. It wasn't hostility, not outright, but it carried the weight of discomfort. Whispers followed him now, carried on the breeze like leaves in the gutter. Elijah took it in stride. He had seen this before, felt its shadow lingering in the spaces where understanding was absent. Brooksville, for all its charm, was not immune to the currents of prejudice that ran just beneath the surface. It wasn't the first time Elijah had been the subject of murmurs, and he doubted it would be the last. Martha, his wife of 43 years, noticed the changes, too. She didn't say much about it at first, watching him from her perch at the kitchen table as he returned from his morning walks. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he lingered on the porch a little longer before coming inside. Elijah had always carried himself with a quiet strength, but she could see the weight pressing down on him now. You're quieter than usual, she said one evening as they sat on the porch together, the sky fading to soft hues of orange and purple. Martha handed him a glass of iced tea, her fingers brushing his as she sat down beside him. Elijah took a sip before answering. Just thinking about that officer, she asked, though she already knew the answer. He nodded, staring out at the street where the glow of streetlights had begun to flicker on. It's not just him, Martha, it's everything. The way people look at me now, like I'm some kind of problem just waiting to happen. Martha's expression hardened. She had never been one to shy away from speaking her mind, especially when it came to matters of principle. That boy's got no business wearing a badge, she said sharply. You know his type, always looking for someone to blame for their own smallness. Elijah smiled faintly. I know his type, he said, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. Martha reached over, her hand warm and steady on his arm. You've dealt with worse than him, Elijah. You've faced men with more power and more hatred in their hearts. Don't let this one shake you. Elijah didn't reply right away. Instead, he let the stillness settle around them. the hum of cicadas filling the space where words might have been. He knew Martha was right, he had endured more than most in his lifetime. But there was something about Travis Bartlett. Something about the way his eyes burned with unearned authority. That stuck with him. The next day, as Elijah made his way to the corner store, he felt that familiar prickling awareness of being watched. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Sure enough, when he reached the store's front window, he saw Bartlett's patrol car idling across the street. The officer's gaze was locked on him, his face expressionless but charged with the same tension as their first encounter. Elijah didn't acknowledge him. He stepped into the store, where Mr. Robinson greeted him with his usual warmth. "Afternoon, Elijah," Robinson said, his voice carrying the ease of someone who had known Elijah for years. "You doing all right?" Elijah gave a small nod, picking up a basket and moving toward the shelves. "I'm getting by." Robinson's smile faltered, and he leaned on the counter, lowering his voice. "I've been hearing things. That Bartlett boy's been stirring up trouble again." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He placed a jar of honey in his basket, studying the label as though it held the answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. Finally, he said, "Trouble has a way of finding men like him." Robinson frowned. "You be careful, Elijah. He's got a chip on his shoulder. And it's folks like us he's looking to knock down." Elijah met his friend's gaze, his expression calm but firm. "I've lived long enough to know how to handle men like him. Don't you worry about me." But Robinson did worry, and so did others. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, the unease spreading through the town like a slow-moving storm. Bartlett's patrol car seemed to be everywhere Elijah went, parked just out of sight. Its presence a constant reminder that Bartlett wasn't letting this go. At the police station, Officer Dave Morgan watched Bartlett with increasing concern. He had seen the way the younger officer operated, the way he seemed to relish the power his badge afforded him. But this fixation on Elijah was different. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was personal. One evening, Morgan approached Bartlett as he was preparing for his shift. "Travis," he said, keeping his tone casual, "you've been spending a lot of time around Harrington lately." Bartlett didn't look up from his clipboard. "Just doing my job." Morgan frowned. "Is that what you call it? Because it's starting to look like something else." Bartlett's jaw tightened, and he turned to face Morgan, his expression hard. "You've got a problem with how I do my job?" Morgan held his ground, his voice steady. "I've got a problem with you turning this into something it doesn't need to be." "Leave the man alone, Travis. He's not your enemy." Bartlett didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed his keys and walked out, his heavy boots echoing through the station. Morgan watched him go, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. Back at home, Elijah sat with Martha on the porch, the day's tension still clinging to him. She handed him a plate of cornbread, her way of comforting him without words. He took a bite, the familiar taste grounding him. "You're thinking too much again," Martha said after a while, her voice soft. Elijah chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "Can't help it." "Then think about this," she said, her tone sharpening just a bit. "You've got people in this town who care about you. Don't forget that." Elijah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The shadows were growing longer, but he refused to let them close in. The air in Brooksville felt heavier now, as though the tension between Elijah Harrington and Officer Travis Bartlett had seeped into the town itself. People whispered in grocery aisles, exchanged glances at the post office, and lowered their voices in cafes. The town wasn't unfamiliar with conflict, but this felt different, more personal, more present. Elijah had become a symbol of something unspoken but deeply felt. Elijah wasn't seeking attention, though it seemed to find him regardless. He still walked his familiar routes, nodding to neighbors and exchanging pleasantries with shopkeepers. But he could sense the shift, the quiet support in the way some people lingered a little longer in conversation, or the hesitation in their voices when Bartlett's name came up. They were cautious, but they were watching. It was Hannah Taylor, the young woman who had recorded the confrontation in the park, who first approached Elijah with an idea. She came to his porch one afternoon, holding her phone and wearing an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice uncertain, I was wondering if you might have a moment to talk. Elijah set his newspaper aside and gestured for her to take a seat. What's on your mind, Hannah? She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. It's about Officer Bartlett. I've been talking to some folks around town, people who've had, well, run-ins with him. There's a lot of stories. Mr. Harrington. A lot of people who've been treated unfairly. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady. That doesn't surprise me, he said quietly. What are you thinking? Hannah bit her lip before continuing. I think we need to do something. Start a petition. Maybe. Let the mayor and the town council know what's been happening. And, she paused, holding up her phone. I've got the video from the park. If people see it, maybe they'll understand. Elijah regarded her for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he nodded. You're brave, Hannah, but you know this won't be easy. I know, she said, her voice firming, but it's the right thing to do. The conversation with Hannah set things in motion. Word spread quickly, and soon, a small group of townsfolk gathered at the community center to discuss what could be done. Elijah attended reluctantly, drawn less by the prospect of action and more by the weight of responsibility he felt toward those who looked to him for guidance. The room was quiet at first, filled with the awkward shuffling of feet and the nervous clearing of throats. Then Mr. Johnson, one of Elijah's longtime neighbors, stood up and broke the silence. We've all seen it, he began, his voice calm but steady. Bartlett's been going after people who don't deserve it. And it's time we did something about it. Elijah here, he nodded toward Elijah, who sat near the back of the room. He's been through enough. We can't let this keep happening. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Hannah stood next, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. She described the incident at the park, her conversations with others who had faced similar treatment, and her belief that change was possible if the town came together. When she finished, the room fell silent again. All eyes turned to Elijah. He took a moment before rising to his feet, leaning on his cane for support. His voice, when he spoke, was low and deliberate, carrying the weight of years lived and battles fought. I appreciate what you're trying to do, he said, looking out at the faces before him. And I agree it's time for this to stop. But you all need to understand something. Bartlett isn't just one man. He's part of a system that's been around a long time. Longer than any of us. This isn't going to be easy. And it won't be quick. But if you're willing to stand together, then maybe just maybe we can make a difference. The room erupted in quiet applause. More out of respect than enthusiasm. It wasn't a rousing speech. But it was enough. Plans were made. Tasks were assigned. And the group began gathering signatures for their petition. Hannah worked with Sarah, the young journalist from the local paper, to draft an article highlighting the issue. Meanwhile, Elijah focused on documenting Bartlett's behavior, knowing that evidence would be their strongest weapon. It didn't take long for Bartlett to catch wind of what was happening. His patrol car became a more frequent presence in Elijah's neighborhood, its headlights cutting through the evening shadows like a warning. Elijah noticed him everywhere, in the grocery store parking lot, at the edge of the park, even idling near the community center where the meetings were held. The message was clear. Bartlett wasn't backing down. But neither was Elijah. Late one evening, as Elijah sat at his kitchen table reviewing the footage he had collected, Martha joined him, her expression soft but serious. You're putting yourself in the middle of this, she said quietly. I know why, and I'm proud of you. But I need to know you're being careful. Elijah looked up, meeting her gaze. I'm careful, Martha. You know I don't go looking for trouble. No, she said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But trouble has a way of finding you. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Outside, the night was still, but Elijah could feel the storm brewing. He didn't know when it would break. But he knew he had to be ready. The next morning, Elijah handed Hannah a flash drive containing the videos he had taken. Use these wisely, he said. They show what people need to see. But they'll stir things up. Be sure you're ready for that. Hannah nodded, her determination evident despite the worry in her eyes. We're ready, Mr. Harrington. As she left, Elijah returned to his porch, sitting in his usual spot with a cup of tea in hand. The world around him moved as it always did, cars rolling by. Neighbors tending their gardens. Children playing in the distance. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The turning point had come. And Elijah, with all his quiet strength, would be there to meet it. The day of the council meeting dawned with an eerie stillness. As if even the wind had chosen to hold its breath. Elijah Harrington rose early, his movements deliberate as he dressed in his Sunday best. Martha watched him from the kitchen, her hands busy with a pot of coffee. She didn't say much, but her presence was steady, grounding. "You ready for this?" she asked as he pulled on his jacket. The fabric a little looser than it had been in years past. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the cap with the faded insignia of his military service and turned to her. "As ready as I'll ever be." The town hall was already bustling by the time Elijah arrived. People filled the seats and lined the walls. Their voices hushed but charged with anticipation. It wasn't often that Brooksville had a council meeting this packed. And it was rarer still for the room to buzz with this kind of tension. Elijah could feel it in the way people glanced at him when he entered. Their expressions a mix of support and curiosity. He took a seat near the front, his cane resting across his lap. Hannah Taylor sat beside him, her phone in her hand, ready to record if needed. Mr. Johnson gave him a firm nod from across the room. And Sarah from the newspaper offered a small, encouraging smile. They were all here, the people who had quietly rallied around him, ready to see this through. At the head of the room, the council members sat behind a long wooden table, their faces carefully neutral. Mayor Livingston, a man whose silver hair matched the ornate clock behind him, called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. "This council has been presented with a petition," he began, his voice measured, signed by over 200 residents of Brooksville, raising concerns about the conduct of Officer Travis Bartlett. "We have also received video evidence to support these claims." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elijah kept his gaze forward, his hands steady on his cane. He knew what was coming next. The videos were played on a large screen at the front of the room. The grainy footage showed Bartlett pulling over a young black man for no apparent reason, berating him in a voice thick with condescension. Another clip showed Bartlett standing outside the local park, glaring at a group of teenagers as though their very presence offended him. And then, the final video, the one Hannah had taken, captured Bartlett's encounter with Elijah on the park bench. The tone of his voice, the weight of his words, left little room for interpretation. As the last clip ended, the room was silent. The council members exchanged glances, their composure strained. The mayor cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrington," he said, looking directly at Elijah, "would you like to speak?" Elijah rose slowly, leaning on his cane as he made his way to the front of the room. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of people he had known for decades. When he spoke, his voice was steady, calm, carrying the weight of a man who had seen much and endured more. "I've lived in Brooksville for over 50 years. He began. "I've served this country, raised a family, and done my best to be a good neighbor. This town has been my home. And for the most part, it's been good to me. But what you saw in those videos, that's not just about me. That's about something much larger." He paused, letting his words settle. "There's a sickness that runs deep in places like this. It's not loud or obvious most of the time. It's quiet, like a shadow, but it's there. And men like Officer Bartlett, well, they feed on it. They use it to justify their actions. To make people feel small. To make themselves feel big." The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on him. Elijah glanced at the council members, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about revenge or making someone pay. It's about making this town better. It's about standing up and saying that enough is enough." Before he could say more, the doors at the back of the room burst open, and Bartlett stormed in. His face was flushed, his uniform crisp but his demeanor anything but professional. He pointed a finger at Elijah, his voice rising above the quiet murmurs of the crowd. "You think you can come in here and smear my name?" Bartlett spat. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Elijah didn't flinch. He met Bartlett's glare with the same calm strength he had shown on the bench that day. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. It's about what's right. Bartlett's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You don't know anything about what it's like to do my job. You think sitting there, looking calm, makes you better than me? The tension in the room was thick. The air charged with the weight of Bartlett's anger and Elijah's steady resolve. Mayor Livingston stood, his voice cutting through the noise. Officer Bartlett, that's enough, he said sharply. This is not the place for outbursts. Bartlett ignored him, his eyes still locked on Elijah. You're just an old man trying to make yourself feel important. It was then that one of the council members, a woman with a soft southern drawl and a reputation for fairness, spoke up. Officer Bartlett, she said, her voice calm but firm. Do you even know who you're talking to? Bartlett blinked, his bravado faltering. The councilwoman gestured toward Elijah. This man served in the military for over 30 years. He's fought for the freedoms you claim to protect. He's earned more respect than you can imagine. The room fell into a stunned silence. Bartlett's face twisted, his anger now mixed with something else, shame. Perhaps, though it didn't sit well on him. Elijah didn't say a word. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded flag. With care, he unfolded it, revealing the worn fabric that had traveled with him through years of service. This, Elijah said, holding the flag aloft, is what I fought for. For people to feel safe in their own town. For justice, not power. For unity, not division. Bartlett stared at the flag, his bravado crumbling. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then Bartlett turned and walked out, the echo of his footsteps fading into the distance. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the room. Elijah stood there, his posture straight, his expression calm. He didn't need the applause. The moment itself was enough. As he returned to his seat, Martha's words from that morning echoed in his mind. You ready for this? Yes, he thought. He was ready. The sun rose quietly over Brooksville the morning after the council meeting. The town, still settling from the previous night's events, felt different somehow. There was no great celebration, no banners in the streets or triumphant speeches. But the air seemed lighter, as though a long-held weight had been lifted. Elijah Harrington sat on his porch as he always did, the steady creak of the rocking chair a comfort against the backdrop of chirping birds. His cane rested beside him, and a warm cup of coffee sat in his hands. The flag he'd unfolded the night before had been refolded with care, now resting on the small side table next to him. He hadn't felt the need to say much to anyone since leaving the council chamber. Words, after all, had already done their part. The decision to remove Officer Travis Bartlett from the police force had been swift and unanimous. The videos, the petition, and Elijah's quiet strength had left no room for debate. The council had acted decisively, their faces grave as they acknowledged the toll Bartlett's actions had taken on the town. Elijah's phone had rung several times that morning, neighbors calling to thank him, reporters asking for interviews, but he let it ring. He didn't need their praise, nor was he looking to become anyone's hero. All he wanted was what he had always wanted, peace. Blank. Underscore. Blank. By mid-morning, Hannah Taylor stopped by, her camera slung over one shoulder and a notebook tucked under her arm. She lingered on the steps, hesitant as though unsure whether she was intruding. Come on up, Hannah, Elijah called out, saving her the trouble of asking. She climbed the steps, sitting on the edge of the porch swing. I just wanted to check on you, she said, her voice quiet. After everything last night, I'm fine, Elijah replied, his tone as steady as the chair beneath him. Tired, maybe, but fine. Hannah nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. People are talking, you know, about how you stood up to him, about what it means for the town. Elijah sipped his coffee, letting her words hang in the air for a moment. It's not about me, Hannah, he said finally. It never was. It's about what's right. I know, she said quickly, but people need someone to look up to. Someone to remind them that they can do the right thing, even when it's hard. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He watched a pair of sparrows flit across the yard, their wings catching the light. People forget, he said eventually. They forget what it costs to stand up, what it takes to stay steady when everything in you wants to fight or run. I've seen what happens when people forget. That's why I couldn't let it go this time. Hannah nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. What do you think will happen now? She asked. Elijah exhaled, the sound soft but heavy. Things don't change overnight, he said, but maybe this is a start. Maybe people will think a little harder about the choices they make. The way they treat each other. And maybe Bartlett will think about what it means to carry a badge. She looked at him thoughtfully. You think he'll change? Elijah met her gaze, his expression unreadable. That's not up to me. But I do know this. What happened last night wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who watched. For the ones who stayed silent before. They've got no excuse to stay silent now. Blank. Blank. That afternoon, Elijah went about his day as usual. He walked to the corner store, exchanging nods with Mr. Robinson, who seemed to stand a little taller when Elijah entered. At the post office, a clerk thanked him quietly, her voice almost a whisper. And as he strolled through the park, he noticed something subtle but unmistakable: the way people greeted him, not with hesitation, but with warmth. Bartlett was gone. His patrol car no longer lingered at the edges of Elijah's neighborhood. No longer cast its shadow over the park. But Elijah knew the end of Bartlett's tenure wasn't the end of the story. Prejudice didn't disappear with the removal of one man. It lingered, quieter perhaps, but no less present. Still, the small gestures, a kind word, a nod, a smile meant something. They were signs of a town beginning to reckon with itself. Its people learning how to step into the light after years of living in shadow. Blank. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah sat on his porch with Martha. The air was cool, the kind that signaled the shift from summer to autumn. Martha handed him a glass of sweet tea, her fingers brushing his as she sat beside him. You've been quiet, she said after a while. Elijah smiled faintly. Just thinking. About what? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. About how things change, he said, and how they don't. Martha reached over, placing a hand on his. You did what needed to be done. Elijah, you gave this town a chance to be better. I know, he said, but it's not just about what I did. It's about what they do next. What we all do. Martha nodded, her grip on his hand firm. You've always been good at reminding people of what matters. Elijah chuckled softly. Maybe, but people have to want to remember. That's the hard part. They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the evening filling the spaces between their thoughts. For Elijah, there was no triumph in what had happened, no sense of victory. What he felt was quieter, steadier, a sense of fulfillment. Perhaps, or simply relief. The storm had passed, but the work of rebuilding had only just begun. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Elijah Harrington knew he would be there to see it through. One quiet moment at a time.